Olá, eu sou Nicole Goulart, sou diretora executiva nacional do Senat e esse aqui é mais um episódio do Just in Time. Esse é um encontro, na verdade um bate-papo, em que a gente lançou há alguns anos para trazer mais insights, para a gente ouvir algumas pessoas convidadas, sejam empresários, sejam pessoas de renome no nosso setor, mais do que isso, sejam pessoas interessantes em que a gente convida para lançar luz em alguns temas. Esse ano, em 2025, a gente foge um pouquinho dos empresários que muito contribuíram com a gente no ano passado e vem com Ziv Carmon, um professor do INSEAD, que é uma renomada escola de negócios no mundo. Ziv, eu vou ler aqui o currículo dele porque é muito bom. Ziv, ele é professor do INSEAD, é referência internacional em comportamento do consumidor, economia comportamental e centralidade no cliente. Reconhecido por sua excelência em ensino executivo, já atuou com líderes de empresas como Google, Toyota, Unilever e Visa. É também consultor, palestrante e especialista em decisões estratégicas em ambientes complexos. Então, nesse episódio, quem faz a entrevista com eles é Daniel Deolindo, que é um analista aqui, do nosso time, que vai conversar aí no meio muito mais acadêmico para trazer novos insights, trazer aí novas percepções. Se você tem interesse em aprofundar sobre esse tema, ou ainda quer conhecer mais sobre os nossos produtos e serviços para vocês, grandes empresas ou empresas que precisam da ajuda do SESC Senat para isso, entre em contato com relacionamento@sescsenat.org.br. Bem, é isso, eu espero que vocês gostem. Daniel está com a gente há quantos anos, hein, Daniel? Ele está aqui. 10 anos, então é uma pessoa muito experiente que vai bater um papo com o professor Ziv e eu espero que vocês realmente aproveitem. Contem sempre conosco. Um beijo, um abraço em todos vocês.
Olá, sejam muito bem-vindos a esse próximo episódio do Just in Time. Queria agradecer a doutora Nicole pela menção. Realmente é um grande privilégio, uma alegria estar aqui no SESC Senat há 10 anos. Hoje nós temos o privilégio de receber o professor Ziv Carmon. Ele é docente do INSEAD, uma renomada escola francesa de negócios, e ele nos dá o privilégio da sua presença aqui nesse episódio. So, we are so pleased and honored to have you here, Professor Ziv.
Thank you.
And it's a great pleasure to talk to you about what we have discussed here. Professor, your research along these ways has deeply influenced how leaders navigate during uncertainty, manage teams, and make decisions in complex environment, isn't it? So, can you briefly explain us what the field in which you specialize is about and why it's so important for the leaders in the transportation?
First of all, thank you for having me here. I specialize in what's called behavioral economics, which is a field that looks at people's decision-making and in particular tries to explore what's called irrational decisions. So there are many decisions that people make that are irrational, and the gist of the field is that if you understand key principles of how people make decisions, then many things that seem like they're sort of random, all of a sudden become predictable. And so basically in my field, we try to really understand what makes people tick, what it is that makes them decide one thing or another. Now, this is important for any leader in an organization because the gist of the work of an executive is really to make decisions and also to lead. And both of these things really need a deep understanding what makes people tick, what it is that makes them think one way or another.
So a better understanding of the behavior of the person or the people who use our service can be an advantage for increasing competitiveness in the sector.
Absolutely. Not only that, but in addition to understanding the customers, also understanding yourself, understanding your colleagues, how to motivate them, how to influence them, and so on is also very important, and that's what we do.
So, and it also can be a key point to develop teams.
Absolutely. So
Great.
it's really key to leadership.
Yeah. So a quick question to your research may shed light on why leaders persist in poor decisions. Why?
Very good question. There are actually lots of reasons. So basically, one of the things that we focus on in behavioral economics is the types of mistakes that people make. And many of them have to do with this very issue of why people persist with wrong decisions. First of all, there's something called the status quo bias, which is this notion that people just don't like to change. And there are several reasons for that, but so including uncertainty. So whenever you're changing, you're not quite sure what will happen. But another reason is what's called loss aversion. This idea that whenever you're making a change, you have to give up something. And oftentimes what you give up is relatively small compared to what you hope to take on. But at the time of the change, whatever it is you give up, all of a sudden seems very, very important and very, very scary. Yeah. And so that's one important reason. There's also sunk costs. So the idea is you often have already invested efforts and resources in whatever it is you're doing, and changing that requires basically admitting publicly that what's happened so far is not ideal. And so that's yet another key reason. A whole bunch of other reasons, but I would say these are the two big ones.
So you study how cognitive bias affect strategic decision in large organizations. So how do bias like over-optimism or anchoring to outdated data influence decisions in fleet investments, infrastructure, or technological innovation in transportation?
There are a whole bunch of ways in which it affects strategy, and not in a good way. So leaders often make not ideal decisions because of these biases. Just as one small example, there's what's called the planning fallacy, which is this idea that we're consistently overly optimistic and how quickly we can finish things. And so basically the idea here is really, even if you've done some things many times, you somehow are thinking, this time I'll get it right. So last time there was a strike and somebody was sick and there was all that, but you think, okay, now I have it. And so you tend to be overly optimistic in doing this. Another problem that people have is what's called the inside view. So basically, whenever you're thinking about a particular project or a particular service you're thinking about launching or any initiative, you typically think about what's unique about that problem, and you sort of forget that you've done a lot of things that you can learn from them. And so people tend to sort of just focus on the unique things about what it is they're doing right now and forget that they've learned many things in the past of what not to do. And so they make the same mistakes over and over again because they're not learning from their mistakes. That said, there are ways to try to get around these types of problems. So some of the things we teach are things like basically looking at what's called base rates. In other words, look at how well things have gone in the past. So basically not look at what's unique about this particular situation, but really look at other instances. Also things like what's called scenario planning, really looking at basically the ways in which things could go wrong in the particular situation that you're dealing with right now. And also just trying to have somebody who's going to play devil's advocate, basically somebody who basically pushes back against whatever it is you're thinking.
Great. And I think that your answers point to one of interesting point that here in Brazil, most of the transport companies are family businesses. So it's a great challenge for them to keep the legacy of the family, but in different scenarios ahead to take decisions. So yes. It's very important to have all this knowledge to balance the tradition and the success in the past, but also thinking different to see the future. So your research discusses how we justify poor decisions. Can you please explain for us how can leaders address the tendency to justify bad decisions, such as maintaining outdated technologies or inefficient contracts that no longer serve the company?
Thank you. That's a very good question. It is very difficult to accept mistakes because mistakes threaten our ego. We like to be right, and more than we like to be right, we hate to be wrong.
For sure.
And so anything that basically makes public, or in fact, even admitting to ourselves that we're wrong is difficult. Making it public is doubly difficult. And it's also difficult to admit sunk costs. So basically to admit that you've actually spent resources not in the ideal way. That's also another problem. And people are also a little bit afraid because in some organizations, if you admit your mistakes, you might be penalized.
For sure.
And this, in fact, actually points to some of the answers of what you can do better. One of the things organizations really need to do is to accept that you always make mistakes. If you haven't made mistakes, in fact, you probably are not doing something right, because unless you're making mistakes, basically it means you haven't been taking risky. I mean, you need to make some difficult choices that involve risk. Unless you've done that, basically you're really playing it too safe. Now, in order to try to encourage people to admit their mistakes, you really need to change the culture and the organization, and it needs to come from the top. So basically the leaders of the organization need to make it very clear that what they care about is not whether you've done something right or wrong, but whether you are learning. So basically the key to really doing well in the future is really learning from what's happened before. And so basically focusing on a learning culture is really very much key. And you often also want to, beyond say it, actually demonstrate it. So in fact, also admit some of your own mistakes as the leader, actually to show people that, that it's okay. And in fact, even praise people. In some really well-managed organizations, for example, they will praise people who've made errors and admit it, of course, as long as they don't do it repeatedly. So the idea is you need to show that you've made mistakes, but that you've learned from them. That's really the key.
So failure is part of the learning process.
Absolutely necessary part.
Yeah. You mentioned about to be open to failure or errors. Can you explain a little bit about this kind of error or failure? Because you mean strategical failure?
Actually, anything. So basically, business decisions are very, very complicated. No two situations are alike. It's not like hard sciences where there's a clear algorithm. And so we need to learn, and we learn by experience. And in fact, when you look at entrepreneurs, for example, the people who tend to be most successful are the people who've failed a few times, because, and of course, those people who've learned from it, because then they know some of the things you shouldn't do. There are all sorts of, these business decisions are very, very difficult, and really the only good way to learn is to try things.
Yeah. I have heard once that we must fail fast to learn fast.
Exactly.
And recover fast as well.
Thank you for adding that. That's another important element of accepting failures. Basically, the organization, in addition to just encouraging failures, need to encourage the sense of fail fast. So basically, try things, but then let's figure out what's going on and then pivot if we need to.
Yeah, correcting the road, better saying.
Exactly.
Your works explore how people decide in difficult conditions. So, given the poor conditions in infrastructure and logistic bottlenecks on business performance, what strategies can be strengthen decision-making capabilities in volatile environments like Brazil?
Thank you. Another very good question. I'll talk about some specific ideas in a minute, but before that, let me just back up and say that one of the difficulties with really difficult decisions like the ones that you mentioned is that they tend to give rise to important emotions. So basically, when there's an important decision, you're really scared or you're concerned. And one of the difficulties is that many of our decisions tend to be affected by our emotions or biased by our emotions. So one of the things you want to do is to actually try to control your emotions and not jump to quick conclusions. And in particular, one additional difficulty is that there is this stereotype that if you are a good leader, you make quick decisions. And that's a really bad stereotype, because if you want to make thoughtful, good decisions, you need some time. And so basically what I'm saying is you need to overcome the urge to just arrive at quick decisions. They're often going to be based on your emotions like fear and so on, and will often not be very good. So one thing is just take time. As part of taking time, there's some things you can do. For example, you can do what's called pre-mortem. In other words, you can try to discuss a particular scenario, a particular way of doing things, and what are the things that could go wrong, and how could I cope with them, and try different scenarios that way. Or you can basically elicit different views. One of the issues is we all tend to have biased views, and one of the good ways to get around that is to get a diverse set of opinions. So basically soliciting opinions from your management team, from colleagues, from other knowledgeable people. It tends to be very, very helpful. And I guess the other thing is right now there's lots and lots of data. So basically thanks to the digital environment, we are bombarded with data, which is good in a way, but also bad, because it's data overload and we don't quite know what to do with it. And so things like basically just simplified displays of data can be remarkably helpful. I mean, and that's not something that many organizations do. Many organizations want to give the leaders all the information, which in a way is good, but it doesn't let the leader actually focus on what is important. And so doing that can help.
So it's not about information, data, but how you collect them and how you present and how you choose through them.
Absolutely. So data, of course, is very useful, but you need to really know how to use it. It's about using the data well, more so than just having the data.
So as you said, so it's important also have data, but another kind of support like colleagues, management team to support this difficult process of decision in difficult situations.
Absolutely, very, very important, and many people don't do enough of that. So they do look at data, but they often put too much weight on this data. Often the data is not clean or wasn't collected very well and so on. So of course, data very, very important, but other things are also important.
Great. Professor, a major focus on behavioral economics is how to motivate people. And this has powerful implications for people management, right? Could you please comment a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the most common ways in which leaders try to motivate people is with money, which is of course expensive, but it's also not very good. There's what's called intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic means I'm doing it not in order to do the actual act itself, but because I'm trying to get something, like money. That is not a very good motivator for several reasons. First of all, people adapt. So basically, if you're giving me more money, instantly I think that that's what I'm worth. So if you gave me a bonus for doing better, okay, I want that bonus every time. Yeah. And in fact, if you don't give that bonus again, I feel like, I've been punished. So it's both very, very expensive, and it also takes the focus away from what the people should be focusing on, which is really doing a good job. So basically, the better way to do it is really to get them to be what's called intrinsically motivated, to really want to do a good job in whatever it is that they're doing. And that, I think, is one of the key roles that leaders have, and it's difficult. You basically need to make the person feel like whatever it is that he or she is doing is really, really important. Now, in some cases, it's easy because some of the jobs really are important. Other jobs are a little bit more removed from the organizational goal. And so really good leaders are able to motivate even the people who are sort of more removed from the key goal by making it clear how they're really making a difference. Now, an additional point is how you communicate things. So basically, one thing is what it is you're communicating, another is how you communicate it. And there is a lot of research showing that the more effective way to communicate is by talking to your heart, not to your brain. So many of us tend to automatically or instinctively try to argue with you or to try to reason with you, which actually doesn't work very well because we don't like to change our mind. We like our opinions as they are. And so it's very difficult to change people's opinions. It's much more effective to talk to your heart, to talk about some goal that you can provide, some good that you can do to the world, to other people. That is much, much more effective. So this is more difficult, but much, much more effective.
Great. Well, it really made me think about, you said before that during the decision-making process, we tend to be led by our emotions, that it's not the best way. But when we communicate, probably is the most appropriate time to communicate our decision or to communicate, propose in what we are doing.
That's a very fair point. Basically, the gist is most of our decisions come from our emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So they come from the heart, much more than the brain. In really important decisions, we need to make sure that the brain also plays a role, but still the emotions play a very important role. And when we're trying to convince people, it's always about this. So if you think about instances in which you're really able to make a change in an organization, if you think deeply, it's because you've touched people's hearts. Oftentimes you did it on purpose. Sometimes you didn't even mean to do it, but typically it's because you did something that made people feel good. I'll just give you a small example. There have been interesting studies on how to try to motivate people that have shown, for example, that just really showing appreciation, telling you did a great job, can be more effective than giving them money, because that really touches them here. Money is sort of this cold thing, it's just pieces of paper, or not even that, it's some number in your bank account. Whereas if I tell you, you did an amazing job when you did this, it makes people feel amazing and it's much more motivating. So again, all about the heart.
Great. So how can leaders foster stronger engagement among operational teams and drivers in challenging environments, such as longer haul trucking or remote logistics operations?
Again, basically many of these jobs are very, very difficult, very challenging. And when people are challenged like that, they often make mistakes. So basically, even if people are very well-intentioned, just what's called cognitive load, having to make, when you're a driver, for example, and you drive for very, very long periods of time, or if you're a pilot, you have lots of responsibility, you need to do lots of things, and that makes it very, very difficult. And so again, making sure that you've actually inspired people to think about the big picture of what they're contributing to other people can make a world of a difference. So really, it's all about trying to connect with them emotionally, which can at least in part help them overcome the major cognitive load that you're imposing on them when they have to do these difficult jobs.
So when I talk to their hearts, it's an invitation to see the big picture. Yes. So how their tasks are contributing for higher purpose.
I'll give you a small example from a very different context. There's this well-known case study about a hospital administrator that basically wanted to have the cleaning staff, the people who clean after the patients, who do work that is not very pleasant. And he basically talked about how they make a difference for people's lives, how they can help people's recovery. So even though what they're effectively doing is just cleaning things that are not very pleasant, what they're doing is helping people live longer, because if you're in a nicer room, it helps you psychologically and so on. So basically the idea is to somehow speak to your heart about things that matter.
Oh, yeah, great. So finally, Professor, your research has also investigated customer psychology in transportation experience. Share a little bit about that.
I find it fascinating to study the psychology of customers And in the context of services, which is what people in your sector do, it's particularly complicated. And in particular, there's often a big gap between what you might call reality and what I call perception. So basically the way in which people internalize what it is that's happening. Further complicating things, when people are communicating with you, they often don't quite know what they're feeling. So they know they're feeling good or bad, but they don't quite know why. So they're often misarticulating what's going on. I'll just give you a very, very small example. There's a very famous case study of a big hotel in the United States where people were complaining very, very bitterly that the elevators were very, very slow. And indeed, the elevators were slow because it was an old hotel. And the hotel management basically looked into what they could do, and they talked to some of the elevator companies, and they were told that in order to change the elevators, it would cost many, many, many millions of dollars. And what they did was to hire a behavioral economist first, somebody who had psychological insight. And he said, you know what? Let me suggest something completely different. Instead of changing the elevator, what I want you to do is to install a big mirror next to the elevator. And that will solve the problem. And indeed, that was what happened. Because basically what happened when you install the big mirror next to the elevator, people all of a sudden are not paying attention to the fact that the elevator is not coming for a couple of minutes because they're basically busy straightening their hair and maybe looking at some other person. And so all of a sudden, things are okay. And the gist of that example is people were complaining, they were unhappy, but they couldn't quite explain what it was they were unhappy about, which was that they felt like they had nothing to do. And so in transportation, it's quite similar in the sense that people are often unhappy, but they often don't quite know why they're unhappy. For example, you need to set realistic expectations. And in fact, well-run companies, some of the airlines, for example, they will intentionally exaggerate how long the flight is going to take, because then they can pleasantly surprise you. Basically what they've learned is every time you disappoint people, it has a huge disproportional effect. And so the idea is to somehow try to manage people's expectations so that they're less often disappointed. Moreover, there's what's called, what I call perception management. So basically trying to manage how you perceive your situation. If you think about transportation as a customer, as a passenger, it's often not a very good experience because you're out of control. Somebody else is controlling everything around you.
Definitely.
And so, for example, just giving people control over very small things, like maybe in airlines, what channel, what movie you see, or whether you want Coca-Cola or water or something, often can give you at least some sense of control. So lots of small things like that can often make a very, very big difference. And it's important, I think, for two reasons. First of all, it solves problems that you might not be able to solve otherwise. And even if you could solve them otherwise, it would be much, much more expensive. So the beauty of using psychology is often it's more effective and it's typically much cheaper. So as a result, basically lots of transportation companies now are beginning to talk to psychologists to try to really better understand what it is that affects perceptions.
Great. So you were suggesting a changing of mindset when we see problems, when we see difficult or challenges in the transportation sector, changing the view for opportunities instead of huge investment that cannot bring the estimated return.
Exactly. So basically in your sector in particular, any change you make is typically very, very expensive. And what I'm suggesting is before you make this big investment, try some easier things.
Great. But so interesting about the mirror example. Thank you for sharing. Well, Professor, thank you for this fascinating diving into the human behavior and its implication for the leadership. Para vocês que estão nos assistindo, é uma oportunidade também de estar mais consciente né, do comportamento do consumidor e isso como vai impactar o setor do transporte e como todo esse conhecimento que o professor Ziv compartilhou aqui conosco pode impactar os seus negócios. Uma última pergunta. Professor, before we finish, one last question. If you could offer one piece of advice to a young executive striving for sustainable, a higher performance, what would it be?
What I would suggest to this person, work to understand people better. So basically become curious and try to learn more about people and psychology. And there are lots of relatively easy ways to do it. There are a bunch of really, really good books that you could read. There are also podcasts that you can listen to. There are good videos that basically summarize really good ideas in very brief ways. And so I'd suggest that people learn more. Also, just pay more attention to your environment. Try to understand what makes people tick. Basically, these soft skills of trying to understand people are probably the most important predictor of success in leadership. So what we do for a living in my school is really educate people. And what we've learned is that these soft skills are by far the most important that you can invest in.
Great, great. Well, thank you for joining us, Professor. And I think that we would take a longer time talking about that. But I think all these tips and insight will be helpful for those who are watching us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Obrigado. E nós nos vemos em breve no próximo episódio do Just in Time.